Good. Well, thank you very much for having me. The best boutique science conference in the world, no doubt. I am a biologist and clinician. I'm not going to talk to you about biology today. I'm going to talk to you about physics, politics, and geology, and I'm going to give you the truth. I've been working in this sphere for 23 years. There's a bit of my biography in the pamphlet. That's just briefly to say I know what I'm talking about. If you're interested, the Lancet Commission, our 47-country report came out this morning. This is not going to be good news for you, and this is why. We are pumping out colossal amounts of greenhouse gas into our atmosphere. This is the Keeling data from Mauna Loa. The atmospheric concentrations going up steadily over time. Those greenhouse gases let shortwave radiation through, and they trap longwave radiation at a colossal rate. This is watts per square metre of the entire Earth's surface continuously, and that's what's happening to the energy gain that we're gaining and building up that we're not losing. It's going up more steeply than the CO2 because there are other greenhouse gases. How much energy is that? It's this much energy in terms of Hiroshima bombs. 8.7 Hiroshima bombs worth of energy a second now being added to our atmosphere. And this stays for a very long time. The half-life of CO2 is long and complicated, but a fifth of the CO2 we emit today will still be boiling our planet in 33,000 years' time, and 7% will be cooking us in 100,000 years' time. This energy gain is staggeringly dangerous. We know that it's driving up sea surface temperatures, record ever recorded, and in the North Atlantic. We look at the sea surface temperatures here. Last summer, or this summer rather, 12 Celsius above normal in the Baltic. Billions of snow crabs died as a result of that, but this is a mass extinction event in progress. It's driving up Earth's surface temperatures. Temperatures always sound a bit low. We're up by about 1.43 degrees from pre-industrial, but just think of the amount of energy it takes to cook an entire planet by 1.5 degrees, especially when 93% of that energy is in the oceans. It's given us the highest land surface temperature ever recorded in human history. And it's worse than averages, because we don't live in average lives. These are the hotspots of temperature. Some bits are getting much, much hotter than others. And this is the hotspots just in July, and you'll see some areas 8 Celsius, already 8 Celsius above pre-industrial. And you'll notice, and we'll come to it later, the poles are warming 4 times quicker than the surface average. That means we're losing land ice, it means we're losing sea ice. And when you start melting land ice into oceans and you thermally expand them, sea levels are going up. And they're going up now already by 1 centimetre every 2 years, and those rates are going up ever more steeply. If you add energy to an atmosphere, you get weather. There isn't any energy atmosphere, and you don't get any weather. The more energy you add, the more extreme weather events you'll get, and the more extreme they will be. Guess what? They're going up steeply too, at actually an increasing rate. And I'm just going to canter through to remind you, because people are already viewing this as wallpaper. It's sort of like what's happening normally. It's not normal. This was the Northern Hemisphere winter, when just the fire in just the east of just one province, of just one country, in just one season, added 2.7% to global greenhouse gas emissions. That was Australia. But it wasn't the only fire. We had Indonesia ablaze, we had Siberia ablaze, we had Angola and Congo, Amazon, California. The following year, Canada ablaze, the whole of Europe ablaze. You'll remember these events yourselves. The same summer, though, we now pivot to flooding. Belgian-German border, Germany on the right, tens of thousands dying in China, in the middle on the right, London flooding, we couldn't admit to 3 hospitals, and the bottom right, those iconic pictures of the New York subway. But on we roll. Flooding in British Columbia, 20,000 displaced. In the end, 104,000 displaced in Malaysia. Australia also flooding. And then we roll into 2022. In the January, highest temperatures ever recorded in South America. Highest temperatures ever recorded in Australia. The Spanish heatwave, the highest temperatures recorded in spring in Spain, followed by the highest temperatures ever recorded in Pakistan and India, where the joke was, if you died and went to hell, you should take a coat, because it was hotter on Earth. Followed by Europe, followed by Japan, Korea and China having their highest temperatures ever recorded, followed by the United Kingdom. North America wasn't spared either. This was Lake Mead, essentially dried up. And then we move through to Africa with massive flooding, highest density rainfall ever recorded in southern Africa and KwaZulu-Natal, highest density ever recorded in Spain and Valencia. followed by a third of Pakistan underwater, followed by the highest storm surge ever recorded in Florida. Venezuela displacing huge numbers, 500 million people being moved, 500 million being moved in Nigeria. January of this year, that was Bilbao on New Year's Day. Insane temperatures, never seen before. Followed by March of this year, this is France, Switzerland, Venice, and Lake Montebello in France. These massively high temperatures breaking records again in Korea. April, another record broken in Spain, the reservoirs drying up, followed by the highest temperatures ever recorded in June, beating the previous year in Beijing. Then we get Canada. Remember the fires in Canada? And these were the images from New York as the smoke poisoned New Yorkers. We move to July, New York underwater, Spain, Oklahoma, back to flooding. Of course, these tragedy of these people trapped in an underpass and drowned in their own cars in Korea. Record temperatures again worldwide, and you'll remember the Canaries, you'll remember Corfu being evacuated. You'll remember we hit August with these sorts of events. Highest temperatures recorded in South America, and the temperatures in South American winter were higher than the normal summer temperatures. This was September. This was Libya. The maintenance of that dam wasn't very good. But the main problem was it had dried out. This was a picture before the dam broke. It was desiccated. The front end of it had become dried out, the soil was dried out, and there was no water in it. And then we suddenly got an 8,000-fold increase in normal rain density. And that shock loaded the dam with a massive impact, which then led to it flooding downstream. This was immediately before, and that was the consequence. And we now know that 14,000 people died. The point is that 1 and a bit degrees is catastrophically dangerous for humanity. We've displaced 43 million children last year from extreme weather events. This is not safe, and it's going to get worse because of the longevity of these gases and their trapping. We're on target for 5.5 degrees with current emission rates in your lifetime, but your lifetime will never get there because you'll be dead long before unless we take really serious action. And as we'll come to, that number of 5.5, as of last week, has been proven incorrect. Let's look at the language used by UN-filtered scientists. So they're not allowed to really speak out, but this was 2021. Species extinction, widespread disease, unlivable heat, ecosystem collapse and cities menaced by rising seas will be painfully obvious before a child born today turns 30. It's not in 30 years' time. This will have happened, and they were saying this 2 years ago. But as we'll come to, it's got much worse than that. We know that even at those current rates, which are woefully inadequate estimates, up to 3 billion people won't be able to live because of the temperatures alone, and we're going to have another 2/3 of a billion people who will have had to move because they'll have been under the high tide mark. That's 4 billion people dead or migrating. But as we'll come to, it's much, much worse than that. We also know that even on the best estimates, i.e. the most conservative estimates, we would have triggered a mass extinction event to rival the Permian by the end of this century. And that's 96% of life on Earth gone. The problem with these things is they're all wrong. They're all underestimates of gravity. And that's partly because our emissions aren't going up linearly, they're going up exponentially. They look linear because we're at the extreme right-hand side of that graph. But emissions are still going up, and they're still rising on an exponential function. But on top of that increase in exponential emissions, we've triggered positive feedback loops now, where heating begets more heating. We've lost surface albedo. This is ice and snow no longer being there to reflect heat back into space, and you're exposing dark ocean and land to absorb heat. That alone has doubled the rate of energy gain on the Earth in the last 14 years. Fires are releasing carbon dioxide, which of course is a greenhouse gas that traps more heat. I told you that we were 2.7% of greenhouse gas emissions from one fire in Australia. Let's look at Canadian fires this summer. That was the amount of CO2 released by July. And that added 6% to global greenhouse gas emissions last year. Just the Canadian fires. And you'll remember they weren't the only ones. Those fires also release carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide normally mops up hydroxyl radicals in the troposphere and lower stratosphere, and that would normally clear methane. Methane is 83 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as is CO2 in its first 20 years. And we're releasing a lot of methane too, and lengthening its half-life. We're releasing it from carbonate rocks, from melting methane hydrates, and from fermenting wetlands. You can see that positive feedback loop. This was the increase in atmospheric methane essentially from use of fossil fuels. When you hear of natural gas is methane. It just sounds nicer. And it was called natural gas by the same people that invented the phrase global warming, because that sounded better than climate change, and the same people who changed drilling for oil into energy exploration. It was a good linguistic fudge. What's now happened, though, is with the positive feedback loops, this is what's happening to atmospheric methane, and you'll see that this is not going up any less steeply over time. We've desiccated our rainforests to the point when now they catch fire, and those fires spread. We're losing 16 soccer pitches every minute to fire, and that's by natural fire, not what we're torching on our own. And we're sticking water into the lower troposphere and higher stratosphere, and water up there acts as a greenhouse gas. We're insulating the land with smoke, so this fires in Australia raise surface temperature by 3 degrees, and the black soot by 0.7 above Australia, and we're punching holes in the Arctic ozone layer. You can see that we've now triggered a whole pile of tilt points. So here we've got North Atlantic Ocean temperatures. Each wiggly line going from January to December is a year, and every year is getting hotter. The black line is this year. It's unhinged what's happened, and that is not the El Niño effect. That's before the El Niño effect's kicked in. This is daily sea surface temperatures in 60 north and 60 south. Exactly the same effect. Something very, very dramatic is now happening. Highest temperature we know for at least 100,000 years. And this, we've showed you the Bering Straits. This is air surface temperatures, same sort of pattern. Rises and falls, every wiggly line being a year, and the red line at the top is this year. It's suddenly changed dramatically. And it's the hottest month, July this year, that's ever been recorded. Let's look at the warmest days on global records ever recorded in the history of temperatures being recorded. All of those were in 2023. And you can see it in ice as well. This is Antarctic sea ice anomalies. And looking at extent departures, and you'll see that we've had this sudden collapse in Antarctic sea ice. The same is applying to the Arctic. There may be no ice at all in the summer. It could be an ocean completely as early as 2030, and in fact it might well be before that. It's worse even than that, though, because climate isn't really the issue. It's weather that's the issue, and weather systems change in binary states. You make one move and suddenly things flip. These events in polar warming are called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and they are rapid accelerations in polar temperature. And they've happened historically many, many times. The one that's highlighted in the middle from this paper in Nature was around 38,000 years ago, when there was a rise of around 12 degrees Celsius in the space of around 15 years. So these things can happen, and they're normally driven by greenhouse gas emissions, whether that's volcanic or whatever. This paper 3 years ago said they thought that we triggered one and that this was going to be absolutely massive. And you might say, well, let's hope, Hugh, that they haven't. All right? Maybe that paper is going to be wrong. Sadly not. It's proven to be right. This was March last year, when Antarctic temperatures punched 40 Celsius above normal and Arctic temperatures 30 Celsius above normal. Bad enough, except for the next day, 47 Celsius above normal in Antarctica. If you look at average Arctic temperatures this summer, they were 32.5 Celsius this summer, against a normal of 13. This is causing absolutely massive ice melt there, and of course we're seeing it in Europe too. Switzerland has lost 10% of its glacial volume in the last 20 months. These instabilities, though, can also cause very sudden spikes. This is the Greenland ice cap. Last September, when there was this sudden red line, this sudden rise in temperature in the first weekend, that led to a rise of 21 Celsius, near enough. 20 billion tonnes of ice lost in a weekend. That's 7% of annual ice melt. Happened in 40 hours. And that's the second year in a row it's happened. We know that when you flip these binary states, it affects ice mass. We know that it's happening already in Greenland. And even temporary overshoots can lead to sudden dramatic rise of sea level. And so whilst linear rises will take us to somewhere around 1.8 to 2 metres of sea level rise this century, as Jim Hansen always points out, historically when these things happen, you get 60 to 80 metres of sea level rise in that sort of space of time. You get changes also in ocean currents. We know that the Antarctic abysmal circulation, dragging in cold water, is declining. Current rates will have dropped by 40% by mid-century. But the Atlantic Ridge overturn circulation is one that we're all familiar with, drawing in warm water from the Pacific and that past Australia. And then we're up there. That's the Gulf Stream for us, which is what means that we don't have the icebergs that you see in Newfoundland directly to the west of us. That's going to collapse. And that's going to cause absolutely catastrophic impacts to civilization and crop. We know we're at a point close to critical transition, and these two papers published here, first in Nature Climate Change, were saying that they're expecting it within about 25 years. That's moving quite quickly. It's probably much sooner than that. This paper, followed by Nature Communications, saying the 95% confidence intervals mean that it might collapse in about 2 years from now. It probably won't, actually. I suspect it's going to be somewhere between 2035 and 2045. Either way, that's catastrophic in its own right. It will also lead to the collapse of the southern radial overturn circulation, and because everything's linked, that would also drive the Antarctic abysmal circulation to collapse. The jet stream is a high-altitude river of fast-moving moist air, driven by the Coriolis effect at the junction between cold Arctic air and warmer southern air. Because the Arctic's warming more quickly, that's moving north. That's going to deprive Portugal and Spain of any rainfall at all, which is why the Spanish president only 4 weeks ago was talking about Spain being uninhabitable in 12 years, because it's pretty uninhabitable now. I mean, it's too hot and there isn't any water for crops. It's going to dump the water on us. So Northern Europe's going to have very, very wet winters and more flooding, as we're already seeing. And if the AMOC switches off, that will be falling as tens of metres of snow. We're already seeing those oscillations causing these cold bombs in Europe, but also particularly in North America. Remember, that was Florida last winter. And we're getting it splitting in the summers. So we're getting these trapping of high pressure ridges between the split in the northern jet stream, and that traps heat, giving this ring of fire around the globe, which is what's incinerating the whole globe. We were just outside it, actually. This year it had moved just far enough north where we had soggy, wet summer where the rest of Europe was cooking. And bear in mind, this is not just climate scientists that are saying this. The military, 20 years ago now, this was the Pentagon report from 2003, talking about the lack of action leading to a significant drop in the human carrying capacity of the Earth's environment. That's billions of people dying. And we are seeing civilization unravelling. This was the Po River last year. That supplies around 20% of Italian agriculture, and it ran dry. It led to massive reductions in crop production, fruit and milk production, with massive economic costs that actually nearly totaled €9 billion by the end of that year. And that's got a lot worse. It wasn't just the food supply, though. The Po River is responsible for a lot of hydroelectric generation. That pretty much ground to a halt. And France too, their nuclear generators, their nuclear power stations need lots of cold water, and there wasn't enough water and it wasn't very cold. And just as in China, they had to wind them back. We couldn't ship goods. This was the Rhine on the 18th of July, when at Cow we were down to 36 centimetres in depth. You couldn't get barges through. You had to get 4 barges for every 1 barge, massively driving up cost of transport. And we're now seeing this too in Panama this year, because the Panama Canal is running dry. They've had to put a 500 container per container surcharge on that, driving up your food and goods prices. And in fact, we've now got restrictions coming through. And by weird way the world works, cruise liners are still going through because they book their slots 2 years in advance, and the food can't get through. Spain facing food shortages early in the year at massive expense. They'd already spent 2.2 billion by May on trying to deal with the drought. That's probably pumped through 10 billion by now. Italy, in the same, they were looking at least €1 billion by April. And we know we're in really big trouble. And let's again say this is not just climate scientists, and it's not just the military. This is now hardcore economists and industrialists. Italy facing potentially in the next 30 years a $33 trillion hit to its economy. The USA, we already know, in the Western Plains by the droughts this year, that was a $9.4 billion hit. 15 confirmed weather events, each with losses exceeding $1 billion. Florida floods alone were $20 billion in costs in August of this year. The World Meteorological Organization saying that we've already hit 4.3 trillion in losses, and they're climbing. And look at this bunch of muesli knitting tree huggers here, the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries, right? They're really a bit fluffy, aren't they? This is what they said in their report, which came out in September. We've left it too late to tackle climate change incrementally. It requires transformational change. Lloyd's of London, another bunch of well-meaning lefties. Plausible losses of 5 trillion coming in the next 5 years, and they've modelled the risk. And I was speaking with them about this last week. They now say we have a 1 in 300 chance in the next 5 years of a single weather event causing just the food economy a hit of $17.6 trillion. The economic cascade of that will be $63 trillion. The world economy currently is around 90. That's the end of the world economy as you know it. And you'd buy a lottery ticket at 1 in 300 chance, wouldn't you? I would, anyway. We're now losing already around $4,500 a second to the world economy. So we're down to the wire, and I'm going to take some questions shortly, but I'm going to rapidly make the point that governments will not solve this problem, right? And we can talk about why later over coffee, but it's down to us. You, me, all of us. Because here are the negotiations against CO2 concentrations, and if you can see any impact there, you've got better eyesight than I have. Here's the last 27 COP negotiations, which, as you can see, have singularly done nothing because the rate of concentration rise is climbing. If we don't get this right, to quote the IPCC, immediately, we've missed the rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. That means you die and your children die. My son won't make it past mid-20s, and he's 17 now. And yet the COP negotiations last year removed any target for peak emissions. And it's far worse than this, because they're still talking about 1.5 degrees, which isn't true. This paper in Nature came out 2 weeks ago saying that we had to be at zero emissions, not net zero, there is no such thing as net zero, we had to be at zero emissions within 6 years to have any chance of sort of saying at 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, that started then, so it's actually 5 years, which means we have to have stopped all emissions by the end of 28. All emissions ceased, halving emissions every year from now in a compound. That's been superseded by Jim Hanson's data from NASA Goddard, because they've modelled in the effects on radiative forcing of loss of aerosols as we stop burning sulfate-loaded fuels. To cut a long story short, what that means is, to quote him, 1.5 degrees is as dead as a doornail. We're currently on target for 10.5 Celsius, and we have very little chance at all of staying below 3 degrees, which will be the end of life as we know it. So I'm going to stop. We've got 5 minutes left. And I can, if you wish, talk about what we can do about this. If we don't act, there is no future for you or your children. That is the stark truth. And if you want to know what people say about how long we've got, I'll tell you the answers I'm getting, but you won't like them. They range between about 5 years to 15, without immediate action. Right, I'm going to stop talking. If you haven't slashed your wrists, I'll take questions.
I was going to say thank you, but I'm not sure. That really is... Oh, that's my alarm to tell you to stop talking.
Oh, well done.
Sorry about that. It just reminds me of Don't Look Up.
Yeah.
Very much so. How do we get people to look down?
You don't. We do it.
Yes, we are people. What do we need to do? Sorry,
Well,
I'm just a bit shell-shocked because
sure.
I thought we've probably got about 50 years to get this right, and we don't.
No.
So,
Well, it's probably something I put to people like Jim because they understand money and I don't. It's all about moving the money. It's all about moving the money. You've got to discard politicians, and that means we've got to help businesses make the right choices as individuals, the way we spend the money. So as individuals, first thing you do is move your bank account straight away. You're funding fossil fuels. You're funding the death of yourself and your children. Don't do it. There are a few banks, Triodos Cooperative, Monzo, that don't fund it. So just do that tonight. You move your electricity supplier because that sends signal to market. You stop eating ruminant meat because that's a massive contributor through methane production. And methane is 27% of global warming potential. So there are things we do on our own. Businesses, in my experience, there are some really evil people running companies, but mostly not. Mostly, people who run big companies are smart and very well-meaning, actually, decent people. But they're ignorant. That's the problem we've got. When they understand it, they can move and pivot. So what we're trying to do in health is to help move the ecosystem, which is 11.7% of GDP, and we're a relatively constrained ecosystem, and if we jump, that 11.7% will trigger cascades in pension and hedge funds. And we've got to vote. That's it. It's down to business. It's down to moving the money. And we can't wait for taxation, legislation, other incentives to be introduced because the governments won't do it.
okay. Anyone who's not so shell-shocked, they can't come up with the question.
So let's go for it. I mean, there are plenty of people in the world with enough money to fund a agricultural biotech program surrounded by self-replicating carbon sequestration devices,
Right.
bacteria and plants. And it really wouldn't take a lot of people relative to the population of the world to go out there and create and release, regardless of what anybody else thought, a self-replicating solution to the problem. So why isn't that happening?
It's a very good question. There's been very limited investment, and the pace and scale has been tiny. And you're absolutely right. I mean, firstly, we've got a biological system that draws down CO2, and it's called a rainforest, but we decide to take chainsaws to it and chop it down. So that seems to me a little bit counterintuitive. And if you put that just in context, just the next 5 years, deforestation will cause the same greenhouse gas emissions as every single flight ever taken since the days of the Wright brothers. So we need to preserve what we've got. But I totally agree, and there's some work in Oxford, actually, some terrific work on algal, sea algae being genetically engineered to go nuts and turn trap carbon dioxide and turn it into long-chain fatty acids or medium-chain fatty acids, for instance, that can provide sequestration. But you're absolutely right. We need to pivot that money into it. I guess I'm not a business person. Right? I don't understand business, but it's very hard when someone's got money, unless it's going to be entirely beneficent, or beneficent, there's the word, beneficent. There isn't a profit incentive at the moment for it because there isn't the right carbon tariff. Everyone's been waiting for it, but it hasn't been put in place. So I don't know how we connect the money. We wrote the Commission report 2014, said exactly that. There's plenty enough money in the world, and there are plenty of solutions. The problem is that no one's linked the two things together.
Thank you. Yes. I'm still reeling from it, so my brain's not functioning properly. Right. But in terms of human adaptability to this, the human biology cannot adapt, can it? No. We've got to use ingenuity. Biology can't cope on its own. I'm dealing with people of other generations who say, oh, we went through the ice ages, we went through this, and it's like, yes, think about evolutionary timescales. This is happening in years rather than...
When you had mobile populations of hunter-gatherers that could stick to coast and move quite briskly, and when the population after the eruption of Toba was probably 70,000 breeding pairs of humans.
Yes.
And now we've got 8.1 billion.
I think it went down to 10,000 at one point, didn't it?
So we can't survive. I mean, there will be humans who will probably survive. They probably won't survive if we get the big mass extinction event, but there will be some humans otherwise. But just they won't be living in a society. Because in the end, I could have talked to you about dengue and malaria and heat stress and a whole pile of things and, salmonella in oceans. But the thing that's going to kill everyone will be mass migration and wars. And the military know that.
The ridiculous point is governments don't like the idea of losing money. Why are they not understanding that you invest a few billion now and you save multi-trillions and society as we know it?
Well,
normally the money argument wins with governments, doesn't it?
Well, if you wanted a very, very brief précis of why our government, for instance, is doing it, it's firstly they're scientifically completely illiterate. There isn't anyone in cabinet that's got a science degree. So they wouldn't understand any of what we're hearing today at all. But worse than that, they aren't briefed. So the people with whom I work in defence and security on this can't even get to speak to cabinet. If you're looking at international negotiations, no one wants the deal. Top of our risk register at the moment, we've got 3 in our national security risk register. In at number 3 is cyber, and in 1 and 2 are climate change and pandemics. So climate change is our number 1 threat to national security. In Russia, the number 1 threat to national security is action on climate change. So they're desperately trying to stop any action on it because if
our
they...
president is the biggest threat to our security.
Oh, well, that's also true. A fair point, but being fair, if your entire nation state will completely implode without selling fossil fuels, you can understand why any politician would fight against that. And that's what we've got, because we've got, bear in mind, the chairman of ADNOC, which is the UAE's oil company, is the president of the COP negotiations this year.
Yes.
Go figure.
I was going to ask you about that one. I think, in the interest of time, and to try and preserve some level of optimism that we might be able to move forwards, thank you so much, Hugh. But really